what a great day, huh? And the movement and the motion, feeling lively. And right after this talk, we're going to have a chance to caffeinate and have some tea and continued conversation. So I am very, very honored and appreciative of Move for Parkinson's and Davis Phinney Foundation for the kind invitation and to be with such august presenters and speakers and ideas that are here today. And I want to really frame my interest in social capital with just a sort of a brief story. As Paulie indicates, I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and grew up on a hill. In fact, I still live on the hill with about 12 Condeluci families. And when I was growing up as a young boy, my grandpa had bought this hilltop and wanted his family to be together, a big Italian family. And so we did. My dad and my uncle began to parcel out some of the land. It was not 4 acres. It wasn't tremendously big, but growing up on this hill was really idyllic. It was a community at its finest, which is when there's unconditional respect and value given to all people, regardless of their situation. And my best friend growing up on the hill was my cousin Carrie, who was the same age as me, lived right next door, and Carrie and I were inseparable. We did everything together. And until I went off to school, and Carrie didn't go to school with me. And I remember after about 4 days of coming home from school with my other cousins, but without Carrie, Carrie was up on the hill playing, I remember asking my mother, what's the deal? How come Carrie doesn't go to school with us? My mama says, oh, honey, Carrie has a disability, and she really doesn't, the schools just don't know how to deal with her. And I said, what disability does she have, Mom? And she said, because I didn't see any difference to my cousin. And my mom says, well, she has Down syndrome, which is an intellectual type of a disability, and so she doesn't have to go to school. And I remember asking my mom, I said, Mama, you mean to tell me if I catch Down syndrome from Carrie, I don't have to go to school either? I was looking for a way out of school, but it was a really interesting introduction to me about who's welcomed in community and valued in community and who's not, and why. Because as we got a little bit older, Carrie and I would go off the hill to community events, street fairs and football games and other kinds of things that happen in community, and I would observe how Carrie was treated by other people. Oftentimes people would ignore her. Sometimes people would make fun of her. Lots of times people would stare at her. All things, I think, that I saw happening years later when my dad came down with Parkinson's. And we would go out, and I would see people behave that same way towards my dad, backing away from him, staring at him, somehow, some way disconnecting from him. And as I saw this with my cousin Carrie as a young boy, it really inspired in me that I wanted to be an advocate. I wanted to change that. I didn't think that was right. I thought Carrie should just be welcomed and included. The same with my dad years later, that he should just be welcoming and included just as he is. And so I told my counselors in high school that I wanted to help people like Carrie. I was a young boy. This was in the 60s, and they said, well, if you want to help people like Carrie, you have to go to college and study their problems, because Carrie has a problem. So what did I know? I thought that was accurate, and so I go off to college, and I'm studying disability issues, and because we were told that the problem was Carrie. The problem was Carrie. Because of the way she behaved and because of the way she was, she had a problem that needed to be fixed or needed to be dealt with. Same was true with my dad years later. When my dad started to tremor, people said he had a problem, and we thought he had a problem, and we wanted to treat the problem, right? Now, when you treat the problem like a tremor or like a gait issue or whatever, that's called micro change. You're trying to somehow, some way facilitate a change in the person, the individual with the disability. That's called micro change. And I just thought that was the issue. If you had a problem of some sort, either a congenital disability or an acquired disability that happened later in life, that was sort of, you just had to deal with that disability and you had to be helped with your problem. And then I got a little bit, I got out of school and I started to practice that and still discovered that the community wasn't changing very much because it was difficult to change my cousin or my dad. And then I began to think maybe my dad or my cousin Carrie really wasn't the problem in the first place. Maybe the problem is the community and the community's inability or the community's insensitivity to the tremoring that my dad had. Now that's a macro issue. Micro is my dad and his tremors. Macro is the community just doesn't give my dad a chance. The community doesn't embrace or see my dad as a fellow community member, but they see him as somebody different. And so I started to shift my practice from micro to macro, and I wanted to change the way the community saw my dad. And I thought the best way to do that was to force them to do that by passing laws or by changing regulations so that the community would have to embrace my dad. And so I did that. I started to do macro change. I became a militant. I became very much a community organizer, and we were trying to get new laws and things that would force the community to change how they saw my dad. And so we passed laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we passed the Urban Mass Transit Act in our country. And you've done the same thing here in Ireland, where you have passed laws that are designed to create a more open society. Yet, people with disabilities, in spite of the laws, are still not embraced. I don't have to tell any family here about some of the isolation that occurs in your life, some of the disconnections that happen because of the disability. We lived it with my dad. And so, as I began to really think, if I want to practice macro change, if I want to change the community rather than have to worry about changing my dad, then I can't do it through laws, because laws don't make people change. Laws don't change behavior. They never really have changed behavior. Now, what laws will do is that it gets people to think a little bit more. When you pass a law like the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, some people will think, well, gee, we have people with disabilities in our society and they should have rights and privileges too. I get that. But what really began to drive my change in practice was when I began to look at social capital as a median for macro change. Now, social capital is just sort of a big word that relates to relationships and friendships. Sociologists call it social capital. And the reason they use the word capital is because what we now know after 50 years of sociological study is that relationships are valuable to us in our lives. Relationships and community actually do unbelievably positive things in people's lives. And the opposite of relationships is isolation. And we now know that isolation actually leads to early death. It leads to people being depressed. It leads to people feeling bad about themselves, having low self-confidence. So what really became then important to me in my practice was, how can I help my dad maintain and sustain relationships in spite of his Parkinson's? I mean, we went to, the neurologist, and they were giving us medicine. My dad was on Cinemet, and it was changing his tremors from this to this. So he still had the tremors. He still looked different, and people backed away. So what we really want to start thinking about is, how can relationships that we have literally change society, change community? Now, I want to just share with you that to understand social capital, and this has been the area of my practice at the university, it's what I've been doing my research on, but to understand social capital is to ask you to think about this small little quiz, this effort of saying, if you could wish for 3 things for somebody that you love, what would you wish for? What would you want for them? Now, when sociologists ask this question all over the world, anywhere in the world, here are the top 3 answers that people come up with. They say that health, happiness, and longevity are 3 things we wish for in our lives. And in fact, if we have those 3 things, our quality of life index actually goes up. But what now sociologists are convinced, and again, after 40 years of study, that these 3 things, health, happiness, and longevity, are tied to relationships. Quite simply, the more relationships you have, the happier you are, the healthier you are, and listen to this, the longer you live. Studies have now been conclusive that if people, as they age, stay connected and stay relevant in a community, they live longer. And what literally leads to someone having a poor outcome in life, perhaps an early passing, is really tied more to social isolation and social disconnection. Now, if these aren't enough, there's more. We know that when people have relationships, that they create these kinds of what sociologists call pro-social behaviors. Literally, you're more tolerant or more honest, you're more compassionate and more forgiving with people that you have a relationship with than you are with strangers. Now, what really bothered me with my dad's situation was he wanted to retreat as his symptoms got more demanding and more dramatic. He wanted to retreat. He wanted to just sort of stay at home. He didn't want people to look at him. I remember him telling me, he said, I don't want to go to church anymore. I said, Dad, what is this? You don't want to go to church? He said, nah, I just feel bad. They gave me a new diuretic med, and it's making me have to pee all the time. And I don't want to have to get up, from church and go into the back and go pee and disrupt the mass. I said, well, Dad, I have something at my office called a Texas catheter. We could strap that on you. We could put the little tube goes under your pants. You could pee during the homily and no one will even know. You could do whatever you want. You could still stay at Mass. You don't have to worry about letting the diuretic disconnect you from going to church. But my dad still, even with that, he said, no, he said, I don't think I want to go as much. And what that was, that disconnection had really nothing to do with my dad having to pee. What it had to do with was my dad felt awkward with people looking at him, staring at him, looking perhaps even down at him because he was different. Now, the notion of social capital is that when you have relationships, and when those relationships stay sustained and maintained, they literally mitigate that kind of negativity. We also know that social capital helps with these kinds of things. Literally, people get jobs through not their skills. They get jobs through other people that they know, other people who know them and like them. I bet you every one of you in this room that have worked, when you were going for the job that you last had or that you presently have, you had to fill out a form, and on that form there was 3 names you had to put on that application form. It's called references, right? These are your social capital that will lie for you. When the job person calls up the reference says, oh yeah, Al Condeluci is a great guy, really does good things. And literally that connection with that person on the reference list actually helped people get jobs. We also know that people maintain jobs not based on their skill at the work. They maintain their jobs, they retain their jobs based on their ability to get along with other people. That's social capital. That's the relationships at work. That's how powerful they are. Now, this notion of social capital to me becomes, I think, a cornerstone piece in the Parkinson's movement. I think we've got to rethink, those of us that are advocates in the Parkinson's movement have got to rethink, how do we keep people connected? How do we keep people staying connected with their communities as their symptoms change? As they become, as they change, how can they stay connected? How can they stay as an active member of community. Now, one of the things that's happened in disability is when people experience disability, whether it's Parkinson's or MS or a stroke or a brain injury, it doesn't matter how a disability might emanate. What actually happens is people feel so disconnected from their previous relationships that they sort of move into silos that are self-contained little worlds of other people with the same condition. Right? Now, and this happened with my dad. My dad got involved with a Parkinson support group. And that was helpful for him and my mom and for our family. But what I really worried about was my dad's disconnecting from other groups that had nothing to do with Parkinson's. There were other groups of interest that my dad was involved in before his Parkinson's started to occur. That kind of connection to generic groups is really what changes the world. You know, we talk about changing the world. But we can't change the world from a vacuum. We cannot change the world from a bubble. The only way we change the world is when we're in the world. And so part of my agenda as an advocate is to say, how can we keep people connected to the community? The generic community, not a specialized community, the generic community. Because when you go to one of the communities in your life that has nothing to do with Parkinson's, and you have relationships with those people, they begin to change their perspective about Parkinson's. They begin to change their perspective of pitying you or feeling bad about you or feeling bad about the condition to this broader notion of acceptance. That's macro change at its finest. Now, Robert Putnam is a Harvard sociologist and has probably been the most preeminent person in the area of social capital. He's written extensively about it. He's studied for 40 years the whole idea of people's engagement in community. And he says that if you belong to no group or no community and you decide to join one, you cut your risk of dying in half over the next year. So the takeaway, you know, Claire was talking about takeaways. The takeaway here is join something tonight. Man, join two things tonight. Two different things. Because as you extend yourself, so do you extend your capacity and connectedness to other people, which in fact makes your life better. Now, in terms of relationships and understanding social capital, there are three major domains of relationship. If you think about these three things like a pie, right? This outer ring is called the ring of acquaintanceship. And these are people that you just meet. You know, as I've been here in Ireland and with the folks from Move for Parkinson's last evening, I began to make new acquaintances with people. Later, Linda and I are going to be doing a workshop on this, and I met her and Richard last evening. Those are acquaintanceships. Now, once you start your acquaintanceships, the real juice of social capital is further inside the pie. So if you think about this as a pie, the really juicy part is in here. Because the more time that you spend with people, sociologists call that regularity, and the more similarities you have of interest and connectedness, the more you move toward bonding, which is covenancy. And these are the most powerful relationships. And sociologists are convinced if we don't have any bonded relationships, or if our bonded relationships are limited, we are at risk. We're at risk of dying, actually. So the notion of maintaining relationships actually starts with acquaintanceships, and then sociologically, the more time we spend with people, and the more we find we have other similarities, the more we create a bond. The affinity is the bridge, and then the time and more similarity creates the bond. So in our work in Pittsburgh, we've developed sort of 4 steps for getting and maintaining more social capital. And again, not just with people who have Parkinson's here. That's okay, that's good, that's fine. But when you connect with people who do not have Parkinson's through something that you have in common, the more you change them. And when they change, the world changes. So with my dad, for example, one of the things about my dad, he loved jazz music. And he was a jazz aficionado. He was a writer. He would write articles about the jazz greats that came to Pittsburgh. And so when my dad's Parkinson's started to occur, we said, Dad, we want to get you connected to the Jazz Society. Because you love jazz, and now you're not able to play like you used to. He was an upright bass man. So step one is, what is somebody's affinity? And I'm talking over and above Parkinson's. Every one of you have lots of stuff that you like, that you enjoy, that you find fascinating. So that creates the bridge, because on the other side of the bridge is a generic community of people who like jazz or like movies or like music or whatever it might be, right? So step one, what do people really like? Step two, where are other people gathered who like the same thing? And then step three, what's expected in that behavior, in that culture? And then lastly, who might be the gatekeeper? Let me just say a word about this gatekeeper and then close. Gatekeepers are indigenous members of a community who, when they reach out to somebody new, they validate that new person, empower him or her, and those persons become connected. They begin to start to become connected to that community. So a gatekeeper is someone who endorses somebody new coming in. So in the Jazz Society, what we needed to do is find somebody inside the Jazz Society that would mentor, facilitate my dad's introduction to other people in the Jazz Society. And so the first night that we went to the Jazz Society, my dad saw somebody that he knew, that he used to play music with. And this fellow who was already a member, he came over to my dad, they started to talk, and this guy started to bring my dad around and introduce him. My dad was shaken, my dad was stooped over, my dad had the frozen features. But as this man introduced my dad to the other members, what actually happens, my dad's value started to go up. Sociologists call that image juxtaposition. It's when the value of one person you're with raises your value. I mean, that happened with me here today. Paulie introduced me. Last evening, Mags was introducing me to people. Mags and Paulie are valued and respected in the Parkinson's community. And so when they endorse me, my value, when they're with me and they're introducing my wife and I to other people, my value actually starts to go up. Not based on anything that I've done, but based on the value of the gatekeeper. So this idea of sociological ideas of staying connected to community are out there for us to look at, think about, and utilize as we find ways to stay involved in the community. So this idea of gatekeeping is, there's so much more to it. And as Polly said, I've written 7 or 8 books on these concepts and constructs. And, on our website, we have lots of videos and whatnot about them. But the magic of community is when similarity of interest overrides differences in functionality. And this is true not only for my dad, it was true for my cousin Carrie, right? My cousin Carrie had some differences. In fact, everybody in this room, doesn't matter whether you have a disability or not, we have things that we're good at and like and things that we're not so good at. We all have differences. So how can we just minimize the difference rather than try to fix it and maximize the power of our connectedness to other people? That's quite simply the kernel of this idea of social capital. And so let me just finish with a poem. And now, when was the last time an Italian guy actually read you a poem anyway? That's not bad. This poem is called The Bridge Builder, and it was written about 150 years ago, but it really summarizes what really I'm trying to say in this talk. An old man going a lone highway came at the evening, cold and gray, to a chasm vast, deep, and wide. The old man crossed in the twilight dim. That sullen stream held no fear for him. But he turned when safe on the other side, and he built a bridge to span the tide. Old man, said a fellow pilgrim near, you're wasting your time with building here. You never again will pass this way. Your journey will end at the close of this day. You've crossed this chasm deep and wide. Why build you this bridge at eventide? The builder lifted his old gray head. Good friend, in the way that I've come, he said, there follows after me this day a youth whose feet must pass this way. And this stream, which has been nothing to me, to the fair-haired youth might a pitfall be. And yes, he too must cross in the twilight dim. Good friend, I'm building this bridge for him. Ladies and gentlemen, our job, our goal is to be bridge builders. Thanks so much for coming today. Please open your minds and your hearts to staying connected to community, and let's have a great day. Thanks so much. God bless.